Right, it looks like we have people lining up. So instead of me kicking it off, please go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Francisco Leiva. I'm coming from NCATS. I want to congratulate all you for these wonderful presentations, for the big effort, and also an example that you're doing to the community. We have seen that, for example, that college education could be some sign of inequity, and we can see the consequences. However, I want to highlight that not everybody we know will go to college, but everybody, for example, go to high school. Now as a father, I have seen that my kids spend more time in social media than inside a classroom. And could each of you explain what could be the role of social media in changing these inequities?
Thank you. Maybe we'll start to my right, Dr. Battaglia.
Is that why you sat me here? Because I go first. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you for that question, and thank you for being here. I just had the pleasure of coming back from the President's Cancer Panel, which convened last week to have a conversation about how to utilize technology and AI in expanding, enabling, advancing patient navigation. So I don't have an answer for you specifically, but I think that that is a priority, I know, for NCI and for the President's Cancer Panel. And we had a very robust discussion about the places where social media and other technology can really enhance navigation. From the navigation perspective, specifically, I mentioned some of the obstacles. It's not, patients don't know they have access to navigators. We don't necessarily have great communication with our community partners. So it's building bridges with the patient and the health system, with the patient and the community, with the community and the health system, where I think social media can certainly play a role.
Thank you, Dr. Samet.
If you remember with the healing community studies, there was the Communities at Heal intervention, and one of the big 3 pillars was communications. So it's key, the realm of communications is, we talked about reducing stigma, telling them about options, treatment options that are available. But it can get even more detailed if you didn't get into, like, for your community, where might you go to get methadone? Where might you go to have a prevention center where you can hang out with people who are also in recovery? So it's, I guess the key is a potential vehicle for effective communication.
Well, COVID highlighted the mis and disinformation that could be spread through social media. And one of the best ways to counteract it is for us as researchers, medical field members, as well as just general community members, to be out there to support appropriate and most accurate information that we can find. I think creation of certain community engagement groups, especially for COVID work or long COVID related research, has been important in looking at not just your traditional media, because depending on which population you belong to, you're accessing different things. And being present and being able to disseminate that successfully is an art. And honestly, I think people are going to write their next thesis on it probably, but I think it's so very important to be out there to provide resources that are not just about education, but that are about connectivity and coming together as a group as well to support one another.
Can I just add, yes. My experience working with the table is that the community really drove the table and the BCRC in how to communicate opportunities for the community. So for example, how do we promote the community forum tonight, and also like which communities are you trying to reach? And so if it's Hispanic communities, you need to go to this radio station. If it's the Haitian community, you need to go to this church. And so I think it's really the voice of the community to inform us what communication venues are most appropriate for the community.
Thank you. Next question.
Good morning, Jim Feldman, Emergency Medicine. Thank you for your presentations. Dr. Battaglia, you somewhat anticipated my question, but I was going to ask about the role of artificial intelligence or how you would envision looking at the complexity of the medical system that one tries to navigate, whether it's with substance use disorder or cancer, and then the effects of social determinants of health, thinking about looking at our own, for example, my own family's journey about knowing that you have to have the appropriate screening test, have a timely reading that's accurate, and all the steps along the continuum, and then overlaying, you can't get to the hospital, like with Dr. Samet's example. So I wonder how you would envision integrating the system change that would actually enable patients to get optimal care and to eliminate the disparities. Thank you again for your presentations.
Nothing like a lowball question. That's a hard question. I mean, one of the conversations we were having earlier this morning with the New England Council of the American Cancer Society around this issue is, what is the responsibility of the health system? And what's the responsibility of the interventions and the programs and the community sort of innovations? And I think it's blurry. I think the solutions in the healthcare system need to be informed by the community. But there certainly are a huge role that our health systems need to play in ensuring that they're utilizing technology to support access to care. But it's certainly not my area. I'm learning a lot about it through this, the President's Cancer Panel.
Any comments from the other panelists? Okay. All right. Next question.
Hello. I'm a little shorter than this. I'm a student here at BUSPH. Very interested in all of your presentations, and the class I'm here with, we're actually like talking about intervention design. And so I think a big part of the lessons they teach us at BU School of Public Health is really focused on like community-led engagement and working in partnership. But I think that's hard sometimes to conceptualize. So I'm interested, like, what does community engagement actually look like to you guys? And then how do you re-engage with them after your research is done to like actually make community-led change?
Yeah, happy to take that one. Not that we're at the second half to your question yet of how do you re-engage with them, but engaging the communities. So I'll give you our case example, which I imagine there's multiple ways to do it, but the focus were these community coalitions. So and it's an easy thing to say. Some existed in communities that were cared about overdose. Some that didn't exist at all and had to be brought together in the case of, within the 67 communities nationally. But it's not easy. I mean, you can put out a call. You can say there's $800,000 a year for 2 years if you guys can go through a process and decide the rules that you'll play by and represent your community well. But getting that representation of the communities is not a given. It's a lot of work, and even with work, is not necessarily. It's evolving, movement towards goal. So I would say, good question, good challenge, and you're never quite there. You're always pursuing that goal. But even to the extent that the time we had and COVID came in and made things difficult, it was striking that there was an energy among the communities to pursue it. And so I leave my 5 years of experience with community engaged research optimistic that there's good stuff ahead. I'm not leaving quite yet.
So first of all, thank you for being here. And thank you, Dr. Wang, for having all your students join us today. It's really important to have your voice here. So thank you for the question. I mean, I agree with Jeffrey. It's not easy. I would remind you that community engagement's a continuum. There's the on, in, and with community. And so our historical approach to research is we do research on the community. And as we're evolving into this community engaged world, we're sort of starting to do community engagement in the community and starting to bring them in. But what we're really aspire to do is the community driven with the community. And I think that we're making a lot of progress. And I think these 3 projects are a testament to the kind of work and just a sample of the work that's happening across campus here. But I think that if we had more time, we could tell you our collective experience is that, sometimes this approach is not aligned with the timeline of the funding agency and the timeline of the deliverables and the milestones. And our measures of success haven't changed to really address relationships and trustworthiness, like we were talking about before. So I would encourage everyone in this room, especially the students, to participate in our community engagement programming. We have our team here with us, Yorma and Rebecca and Kareem, and others who help us implement our community engagement programming, which includes longitudinal learning collaboratives and different symposiums where we sort of, we tackle these issues sort of out loud with each other. And so you're lucky to be in Dr. Wang's class.
We know, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. We will continue to think about it, think on it.
Yeah, if I can just add on ever so briefly, your second part of your question was important. It wasn't answered of how do you sustain and how do you go back and give feedback, but I'll just put it out there. It's an important question.
Yeah, I think that's something scientists, researchers miss a lot is the re-engagement after. And that's been my experience too. And what community members have told me is like, that's the most important is you can't just go and ask them a bunch of questions. You have to come back with the solutions and community-led solutions.
You should talk about the dissemination of results.
Well, we're in the thick of that nut trying to crack right now. And I would say it's complex in ways that you don't imagine because you have community partners, which were part of you in undertaking the intervention. And yet you have journals that you're now writing up your results, submitting articles to that say you haven't made this data public yet. So the blurry line of public between the core research team, okay, you can understand, but your colleagues in these communities that are part of the coalitions are part of the intervention and part of the research team too. But that's a lot of people. And does that go over the blurry line of you've made your data public already? Anyway, these are things we're grappling with. And then since there's 67 communities over 4 states, how do you tell people at a time when they don't find out from some leak somewhere else? Can you do it all at the same moment? Anyway, they're real practical, interesting questions.
I would just point out that's a really great example of an institutional or policy that's in place that is not aligned with community engagement. And that's the work of the CTSI and our programs is to really sort of identify and overcome some of those institutional barriers and sort of think about why do we have this policy in place about, sharing results? Because it's counter to the community engagement process.
There's some questions that we've gotten through our video conference platform.
Yes, thank you, panelists and Natalia, so much for facilitating. So 2 questions came in. The first is, how can you engage communities and build confidence with them, especially with substance use disorder and others such as non-English speakers?
Maybe Dr. Samet start?
If I heard that right, Yarma, it was how do you build, gain the trust of people in community around substance use issues? I think that wasn't as hard as it's perceived by the person who put it in the question. In part, perhaps because the people on the coalition weren't a random selection of people, and the people on the research team weren't a random selection of people. Many of them, not all, but many of them had track records of trying to better the lives and the treatment for people with substance use disorders. So I think both the community and the research team came in with some credibility so that of all the things we were questioned about, that wasn't one that sticks in my mind.
And what about non-English speakers? I think that was also asked.
In terms of my research, I think part of the bigger challenge is not having tools to engage with a wide variety of audience because they are not well vetted as some of the English screening tools or questionnaires. So I would urge the funders to actually help us build that tools. But having said that, having a robust interpreter services within the institution to allow for engagement, and then having diverse research personnel who look like and identify as the communities that they are going out to is really critical in having community participation and that give and take that we want as part of this process.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Catherine Wang, School of Public Health. I'd like to thank my students who are here and asking great questions. I have a few, but I'll start with maybe an easier one tying into the dissemination issue. I'm particularly curious about the sort of what are we doing here in terms of measurement and understanding sort of like what's going on each of these sites, because it's multi-site, and thinking about the contextual issues and data we're collecting. But related to that, thinking about, especially Jeffrey, in your study, we're engaging with the communities, we're working with communities to come up with their own sort of ideas about what strategies will be most effective. And so I'm curious about what happens. Is tailoring always better in that sense? And thinking about what if the strategies are chosen are sort of like they're evidence-based, but they may not necessarily work as well. And thinking about dissemination, when we get the data and there's variability where some sites are going to do better than others, how do we disseminate that back? Because no one wants to hear that their site didn't do as well. And so there's sensitivities there in terms of sort of the outcomes and thinking about those sensitivities and how we potentially need to address that.
Right. I heard 85% of that. But I thought, so one piece you're asking about, how do you communicate back to communities outcomes that may not be as good as they might have been hoped? If there's another piece of that, I'll have you repeat that. But I'll tell you, we're talking about that right now. And actually part of the discussion is, and it's not a settled issue yet, because the group has sort of moved, the research group has kind of moved into vacillated on this, is to not share community-specific data with other communities. So no community is shamed, if you want to call it that. On the other hand, communities really want to hear about their own data. So I don't know where we'll end up, to be honest, but I think we definitely want to share the community's data with them and let them know whether all the other communities have a right to know that this community was the best or this community was the worst. That's where we're trying to avoid. But what the range of community outcomes were can be shared. So that's kind of where that's moving. But not fixed as yet. Was there another piece to your question?
Yes, this is more about thinking about measurement and thinking about when we're evaluating these approaches, what are sort of, to explain variability across these sites, what are sort of some of the contextual factors? I mean, Tracy, you talked a lot about barriers and whatnot. Every site has different contextual features. What are you looking at particularly to try and explain if something worked or how well it worked or why it didn't work in particular? That may be site-specific.
Right. So I'll just say in brief, there's both qualitative and quantitative research going on. So, and the quantitative research isn't just the administrative data, which is most of the data for the study. So like who's getting medications, that's from Medicaid data or from the PDMP, a system that knows about opioid medications. But it's also from qualitative interviews, talking with the stakeholders, talking with the program people, did things change, talking with individuals receiving services. So it's a mixed methods, basically. There's some extra survey data as well, but it's from all those sources that we try to get an understanding of what might, and of what the planned program, the planned interventions, you can plan to say, we're going to do this, that, and the other, but what actually got implemented, because not everything that was on the list got put into action. Certainly not always in a timely way.
I'll just add that Marilyn Drainoni is leading sort of the implementation data for the Healing Community Study. And there's a ton of, as Jeffrey said, a ton of qualitative and quantitative data, survey data, looking at the coalition function and structure. Linda Sprague-Martinez is leading a paper right now looking at the coalition charters, just to see what the variability is there. So, this is an area of infancy in the field. And so I think we're probably going to learn a lot from the Healing Community Study.
As you can tell, Tracy was involved in this study as well as that study, as well as her own study. She's busy.
Thank you.
Hi, Chris Shanahan again. Quick question. Did you Did you run into situations where communities, when reviewing the data, and there's a lot of data, that they misinterpreted the data or that they ended up running in the wrong direction with it? What was that like? How did you deal with it? And how do you manage that?
For the Recover study, we recently published a cluster of symptoms that identified people who were more likely to have long COVID versus not. And that was misinterpreted by a lot of people because it talked about the top 12 symptoms. But does it mean that people who had less frequent symptoms actually didn't have long COVID? Well, that's not true, right? It was a clustering study that focused on the most common symptoms and how people fell within those categories. So to be able to relay that message, there were a lot of community-based organization-led talks to clarify that, as well as a lot of publicity surrounding the results with the clarification and caveat that what the preliminary results actually mean. So it is always a balancing act of how quickly do we disseminate and what message do we want to share with our community members without minimizing what their lived experiences are. And I think we are still learning from that experience, honestly.
I would characterize the decisions that were put forward by the coalitions that I thought, or our group thought, may not have been so wise, as not necessarily misinterpretations, but sometimes getting in the realm of conflict of interest, one stigma. It's the other stuff that gets in the way. And to address it, you just try to openly put things on the table. And maybe the other people in the coalition will recognize that. And the coalitions, I think, worked, to my novice experience, remarkably well at kind of like the court where they say 12 honest people come up with a reasonable decision most of the time. It's not all the time, but most of the time. And that's kind of what we saw happening in coalitions.
I'll just add that in my experience with implementation data, when you give implementation data back to the intervention group or the people who were responsible for doing the group, whether that be in the healing community study or in the TRIP study, that's challenging because I showed you the implementation data. It didn't mean our navigators weren't amazing and working really hard and doing their best. It's that it's complicated. And I think we saw that a little bit with the healing community study when we looked at implementation milestones and benchmarks. Are you meeting your milestones and your benchmarks? Well, you're creating great relationships, you're increasing your networks, you're doing all this wonderful work, pulling people in, but maybe you're off on a metric or two. And so I think there's tension in sharing that data back from an implementation perspective. And I think, how do you address that? It's, you co-create the metrics together, you co-create, the delivery of the message and how you contextualize the findings. And then, you have to have some underlying trust and trustworthiness in order for that to go well, because it could go poorly.
So, I guess more internet questions.
Yes, thank you. There's one more that came through. So the participant notes, a lot of individuals rely on social media as their primary news source. And so when utilizing social media as an additional outlet in the hopes of reaching a larger audience, how can you ensure that the information is a reputable source?
I would say we sort of control the way social media time was purchased with some of the $800,000 they got each year to get messages out via ways that I don't claim to understand, but there the message was controlled. What subsequent message lines got out there, I don't know. And one of the research questions is, how effective is that in terms of decreasing stigma, which might be part of the purpose, or getting people to medications more often? But Yeah, controlling the message, we just controlled it because we paid for it.
I don't really have anything to add other than maybe next year's symposium should be on like social media and tech and AI. Because I think we have a lot to learn in that respect. But again, finally, the only thing is though, depending on your community to sort of drive sort of where those messages are going, because you want it to reach the right sources. And so I think our communities know that best.
So I think I want to dig a little bit more into two topics, but maybe start with impact. So the community engagement is still, all three of you have been using it in major studies, and yet understanding the impact itself. I know how to design a clinical trial. We know those typical metrics and measures and evidence-based or, well-studied measures that we use. And yet now we're doing, we're having billboards, we're talking on the radio. This is kind of, as a researcher, these are interventions that I'm not used to measuring the impact as well. So maybe drill a little bit more. You all have touched on it, but I think it's really facing us. We want to, in my mind, it's related to sustainability in the data to show the impact. And so I know this is a hard question, but I also know you all have thought about it. So drill a little bit more how you're going to do that with your respective work.
So if I understand correctly, the question is how to sustain the impact of the study, keep the momentum going.
And figure out the impact. So you're working so closely with the community, and I study pain. I'm going to do more. Those outcomes. But if they're giving recommendations, how I might change my flyers for recruitment, how I change my language, then how do I show that actually impacted the results?
So I think the real-time changes that we are proposing to make through our community partnership table is incorporating the feedback into the education forum series and talking about topics that are relevant today and are prioritized by our community members. The goal is to build a long-lasting relationship that is built on trust and that will survive beyond COVID-19. Because one of the challenges we faced was getting the momentum going to open this dialogue, and we don't want it shut down once the funding goes away for our study. The real measurement of what the community partnership table means would be at that time, if we have built that relationship, whether we can sustain it, and also how we are incorporating even the National Community Engagement Group feedback into our research strategy, our priority topics for research, which is a big thing because long COVID is not just one disease process, it's a multi-system illness. And so how are we distributing the funds that have been allocated to address the questions and concerns that are brought up by members of the community living with long COVID? So I think there are multiple ways to look at the impact. So today, as well as 10 years from now, as well as decades later. And the partnership table hopefully will survive that journey.
I would say that, as I mentioned earlier, and I think we all know that science of engagement is sort of in its infancy. And I would say a couple of things. One is we need to be creative in the type of data that we're collecting. And, we can't necessarily rely only on quantitative measures of engagement. There are some evolving quantitative measures, which are great. Dr. Goodman from NYU is doing some amazing work measuring engagement through her REST tool, which is a very well validated tool that's evolving to sort of meet the needs of these kinds of relationships. But I think if I learned anything from the healing community study, it's the power of qualitative data. And from my colleague, Linda Sprague Martinez, and sort of look at the charters. Like there's these data that you can dig into that are not your traditional metrics that can tell a story. And the Institute of Medicine created a new framework for community engagement. It was published in 2021, I think. And at the heart of this sort of framework of health equity is community engagement. It's like the 10 principles of community engagement are at the center. And if you really implement them, then there's these 4 pillars or propellers that will move. And if they all move together, then you get health equity. It's shared knowledge, relationships, thriving communities, health systems, policies and procedures. And they just this year then published a follow-up to that framework on how do you measure the impact and different components of that framework. And they include things like impact stories, like actual stories of relationships that have been successful, in addition to some other quantitative tools. So I guess the message is it's evolving. There are some tools out there. We need to be creative.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just a couple things to add on to that, which is some of it's classic outcomes, which is RCT. There's opioid overdose deaths in the healing community study. There's how much MOUD got out, how much Narcan got out, and then measuring stigma going down. So there's actual administrative data used for outcomes. There's survey data of certain key players that Tracy was alluding to. That's both quantitative, it's survey, but also the qualitative stuff. And that's turned out to be a very rich source. And then I'd say 2 other pieces. One is we went to the communities when we finished wave 1 intervention, and we said, like, how did you see the difference? And the message that I got in terms of going to these communities was there's communication between people in this field, in this very community that never existed before. So there's some connectiveness there. And then the last one I lost. But so it's multi-layered.
And I appreciate stating the creativity that needs to go that needs to go into it, because it is in its infancy, which is actually exciting for the students also in the audience. I want to talk a little bit more about 2 things that have come up. One and that are interrelated, and that is building trust and accountability with your partners. And how did you initially approach that? And were there some things maybe that you maybe would have done differently now that you've gone through it?
I think for our study, there was a big mismatch in the timeline of when we started recruitment and when the partnership table came together. Funding and putting aside dedicated resources to invest in community engagement, even though it was pre-specified from the get-go of the study, getting things mobilized and to a point where we actually had a partnership table, there was a good 6-month lag. And I think we need to be mindful of those timelines and have those pre-existing relationships. So having pre-existing trust relationship that we can build on, and then moving the needle forward is going to be what we need to do in the future. Building trust is a long process that I'm still learning about. It's easy and difficult at the same time, because it depends on who you're talking to, who your audience is, and how receptive they are to what you're telling them, and how willing they are to partner with you. Like, is it a priority for their community? If it is not, then it's extremely difficult. If it's a priority, then it's easier to bridge those gaps. And sometimes having ambassadors in the community who can relate to the people you're trying to connect with, as well as serve as a trusted member right from the get-go. I have found those things are super helpful when we are trying to do any programs, educational, informational, what have you, within specific communities. And I'm sure there are other ways, because I'm relatively new to the field too, so.
So I would say 2 things jump to mind. time and COVID, what I would do differently. You have no control over COVID. I mean, COVID, this is all about community engagement. All of a sudden, there's COVID where, although thank God for Zoom, things didn't stop and they just took a different format, so they were possible to move forward. But even when you're giving naloxone education and you can't do that, and then you need to engage the health system and people, nurses are being pulled into COVID duty. So that was a challenge. But the other piece, the time, that was the COVID challenge, but we just lived with it. But the other piece was the time. And this kind of gets at the NIH cycle. You know, the NIH cycle is 4 or 5 years for a research grant. And when you try to implement change in a system, in a community, it's begging reality that you're going to change a health system in such a short period of time to, I mean, the process can still change the system, but to have the impact appreciated in the time frame that you're going to do your measurement is particularly challenging.
Thank you.
I would add to that, just showing up, you know, being present in the community is so important. And I've shared with many of you sort of over the course of my career, early in my career, people used to say, why do you keep going to those things? Like, why are you doing X, Y, or Z and not writing the next grant? Because it was important to me to show up to understand what the community needed and where they were. I will say it gets harder and harder to be present in the community when you get busier and busier and the measures of success are not aligned with showing up in the community. And so if I could do anything differently, it would be being more present in the community. By extension, I have fabulous teams that I work with, and my teams and are in the community a whole lot more than I am. That doesn't make me feel good. I think it's just a reality of our system. And so I would say to especially the senior members of the research community that are here, we have to show up. We have to be there in the community. We can't just let our staff and our junior faculty be present, because that's not how you build trust and trustworthiness. And I recognize the tension to do that because we need to be present at these things. But I think that's an inherent, I think, translational challenge for us.
Yeah, just a little follow-up on that one. Although it is a challenge because everybody's busy, it's really fun. I mean, it's really the fascinating part of being involved in community engaged research.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really wonderful. I almost want to talk a little bit about sustainability. I just don't know how much time we have. Maybe a few words of wisdom. And again, thank you so much for speaking this morning. And the sustainability piece, I feel, has been a strong theme this morning. So maybe a couple sentences.
I'll say something brief, which is, that was the fourth thing I can remember. The metric of outcomes is really, we're not there yet, but what gets sustained beyond. One piece of it that was useful, it was sort of talked about from day one. So it wasn't like, okay, we're done. How are we going to sustain it?
I would just say small iterative change. Small iterative change. In the call this morning, one of my colleagues said, oh, Tracy, you're still doing this? Like, yeah, we're still at it because it's small incremental change.
Thank you. Dr. Marathe.
I would second what Tracy just said. And building, like having institutional leadership commitment to sustain the relationships that their researchers and community members are building is going to also play a vital role going forwards.
Well, thank you so much. And again, I want to thank the speakers for the very interesting session this morning. Thank you.